Education is preparation for reparations.
So, thank you very much. I hope you had a good water break. And we will move speedily into our first panel of the day, which is from London to Lome, drawing on sources of pioneers to revitalise Pan-Africanism. To lead this will be the CEO of the Africa Centre and a rather wonderful man, Olu Alake. Thank you, Olu. Yeah, give him some love now.
Thank you and good afternoon, everyone. It's wonderful to be here today, to be on that continuum of history which His Excellency was speaking about earlier, and to introduce this particular first panel, which is looking at the journey from London Conference in 1900 to the Lome Conference in 2025. Drawing on the sources of pioneers to revitalize Pan-Africanism means that we are drawing on from the wells of history to inform, to understand our present and to inform our future. So this is not just a theme. It's a call to action. It's a challenge for us all. But we need to know what it is that we are going to be acting on and what it is that we have learned along the way over the last 125 years. In 1900, just a very short distance from here, the first conference took place. It was a moment of vision, a moment of defiance. And the color line, which W.B. Du Bois mentioned back then as being the defining problem of the 20th century, is still here. We're still seeing it in various manifestations: economic exclusion, the border regimes, cultural erasure, new forms of global anti-blackness. So what does Pan-Africanism mean today then? And how do we reclaim it? Not just as history, but as a living, breathing practice which will help to ensure our emancipation, our economic emancipation, our cultural emancipation, and of course, our political emancipation. Pan-Africanism has been shaped by revolutionaries, poets, policymakers, and organizers, from Nkrumah to Padmore, from Garvey to Sankara, and indeed to the very distinguished panel that we have here today, which is a very powerful gathering of thinkers who embody that spirit across generations. We have Professor Hakeem Addy, a foundational voice in recovering and retelling the histories of African and diasporic resistance. We have Professor Gus John, whose radical legacy spans education, activism, and community transformation. Dr. Kesewa John, who brings memory, scholarship, and cultural work into powerful dialogue. And of course, Dr. Akiaba Adaisebo, the visionary behind Black History Month in the UK and a lifelong architect of Pan-African policy and purpose. So we are here not just to reflect, but to reignite that flame, to ask, what have we learnt? What must we carry forward? And what must we let go? How do we build a Pan-Africanism that speaks to the world we are in and indeed builds the future that we want? So let's start. First of all, I would like to invite to the podium Professor Hakeem Addy. Professor Addy.
Okay, greetings. I hope this is working. I have to actually make a confession before I start. I'm rather upset because the Deputy Vice Chancellor of SOAS mentioned various alumni of this famous university, but did not mention me, even though not only did I do my PhD at this university, I was also an undergraduate at this university. I spent 12 years at this university. And I was also one of the first people to begin the study of diasporas at this university. So the fact that I wasn't mentioned at all tells you everything you need to know about Surrey. But I'm putting all that to one side, and I don't want to mention it. What I would like to do, first of all, because we're honouring pioneers, I just want to give a shout out to one of the delegates to the 6th Pan-African Congress, Zainab Abbas, who's sitting back there. And so to say something about history, it's always unfortunate when we begin history in a certain place and time, because then we lose so much. And if we begin, why should we begin in 1900? Because Pan-Africanism is not just about various conferences and congresses that are called. So I'm going to start back in the 18th century, where I like to start, with one of the key moments in the history of Pan-Africanism, which were the revolutionary events in Haiti. So what did the revolutionary events in Haiti teach us? First of all, they taught us that we, that is not governments, not states, but the people of Africa, are the makers of history. They showed us that any situation can be overturned. That if people organize themselves, irrespective of where they originate, irrespective of which language they happen to speak, but organize themselves appropriately, that anything can be overcome. And they also show us that to make real progress, those systems which are oppressing us need to be completely removed. And so this is a very important starting point, because even if we talk about reparation, repairing, we need to address and deal with a system which is not just harmed us or created harm in the past, but which continues to harm us. And so I think that's a very good place to start. I don't want to say anything too much about the London conference, but because His Excellency made some remarks about Manchester, I just wanted to say a little bit around Manchester. It's interesting that the Manchester Congress is sometimes mentioned, very often mentioned, but without people actually thinking about what its significance was and what its significance is today. The first thing about the Manchester Congress, which, as everybody knows, was held in Manchester, but actually originally was going to be held in Paris. But then the weather was better in Manchester, so they moved it out there. The first important thing about it was that it was a Congress based on the masses of the people. It was recognized that the most important people in making historical change were those who did all the work. The working people, the farmers, and so on. Everybody who attended that Congress was a representative of the masses of the people in Africa or the Caribbean or wherever it might be. It was also recognized that the masses of the people are the force which is going to make change, and would make change at that time, particularly in the anti-colonial struggle. And that is also true of today. That is by organizing the masses of the people that progress is made. The third thing which that Congress very clearly identified was that it completely rejected the colonial borders of Africa and refused to acknowledge them. In addition, it rejected what had been imposed under colonial rule, that is the economic and political system which had been, we can say, the capital-centered system which had been imposed from Europe. It rejected that completely. Of course, there are many other things that could be said about it. But just those few things I've mentioned give us a starting point when we think about any possible progress that is going to be made. Are we talking about a progress, any type of progress in which the masses of the people are at the center and are the main forces for change? And when we look at some of the other principal pioneers and fighters for the unity and liberation of Africa, we can judge them all in a way by how far they adhere to the principles which were first established in Manchester. Of course, one of the other key principles was for using force if necessary, to make political change. And as I say, if we look at some of the key figures, this year we celebrate the centenary of the birth of Malcolm X. Did he carry forward and implement the principles which were delivered at Manchester? Yes, he did. I don't have to explain to you how he did that. He even said by any means necessary. But he was a man of the masses who sought the unity of people in order to make historical change. Last year we celebrated the centenary of the birth of Amilcar Cabral. And if we look at his approach to the liberation of Africa and to, again, to repairing the damage which had been inflicted on Africa, in his particular case by Portuguese colonialism, what approach did he take? Again, the important thing was to go to the masses of the people, organise them, and put them at the centre of things. So I think these are very important lessons, and as I only had whatever I had, that's all I'm going to say.
Thank you very much, Dr. Adi. So just to make clear, we will start by each of the panelists giving a 5-minute address, then we'll get into questions and answers, and we still intend to finish at 3:30. Okay, next up is Dr. Akaba. Are you happy to sit or to stand?
Good afternoon. Greetings from Africa. I'm standing in front of you now, I'm mourning. Yesterday, at 2 a.m. in Abidjan, we lost a Pan-African son. His Excellency Amara Essie. Amara Essie was the last OAU Secretary General and the first chair, interim chair of the African Union. He died yesterday at home in Abidjan. I want to use my 5 minutes, with your permission, to pay tribute to His Excellency Amara Essie. Amara Essie was formerly the president of the UN General Assembly, president of the UN Security Council, chairman of the Non-Aligned Movement, chairman of the Group of 77, and also was a very long-serving foreign minister of Côte d'Ivoire, Ivory Coast. He was a very good friend of mine. We worked together. I served as his special advisor during the transition from the Organization of African Unity to the African Union. And not only that, we also worked in the field to facilitate an end to the civil wars in Liberia and Sierra Leone. He has not been well for quite some time, and an incident took place in Sierra Leone. I'll go back a little bit, it's very important. I worked as Special Envoy of International Alert, and was mainly responsible for facilitating dialogue, first with Charles Taylor and Abacha during the Civil War in Liberia. We analyzed the situation, and we noticed that there were two protagonists in the whole conflict in Liberia. It was the Nigerians and then the Taylor's forces. So it was important that if anything can be resolved, it could not be resolved by the interim government that the international community recognized. It had no army. Their army was the ECOMOG, led by Nigeria. So it was to get them together that I proposed and managed to get Taylor and Abacha together in Abuja, and they prepared the ground for elections in 1997. After the meeting, after we were departing, I told them to hold on. And I said that peace in Liberia without peace in Sierra Leone will be meaningless. So they charged me to go to Sierra Leone to go and find Fode Sanko and the RUF and bring them to the negotiating table. So that was what I did. And I could not have achieved that without His Excellency Amara Esse. At that time, he was the president of the General Assembly. I went to see him in New York, and I told him that, look, I have the potential. I know the actors, and I can help, but I am a refugee, and I travel with a refugee passport. So I'm quite vulnerable, and I need support of your country to help me to be able to achieve what we want to achieve. So he agreed, and he sent me back to Abidjan and to see the president, Ufo-Boigny, at that time. And they made it possible for me to have security and access through the land, the territory, to use that territory as a base to be able to get through to Liberia and Sierra Leone. Like that. So he did very, very well. But not only that, when I got the rebels from the bush to Yamoussoukro to come and begin a process of engaging in peace building through dialogue, it was led that there was a first delegation that came. Then it was led with the leader that had to come. That is Fode Sanko. So Amara, I was supposed to go, and something happened, I couldn't go. So he took the helicopter trip and went into Sierra Leone territory to bring Fode Sanko. But an accident happened. When he got the helicopter landed, as he was getting out of the helicopter, he fell and hit the hip. And the hip troubled him for years. So sometimes he would say, Ade, Sibo, I took the fall, your fall. It was my fault, you took it. So he was a wonderful person, a human being. And what I recall of him, please, forgive me, let me say this. He will always say that I'm no one's puppet. I'm no one's puppet. What he meant was that being in that position as the Secretary General of the African Union, the African Union is a very complex, or the OAU as it was, a very complex thing. There are so many pressures on you and all that. But he will not be corrupted by anybody. He will not allow himself to be corrupted by anybody. And that was his personal character. And please, I am standing here to pay tribute to him because he was dear to Africa. I would like you all to join me in a 1 minute silence. And I would like the African Union anthem to be played in tribute to him. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Pan-Africanism is a countervailing force. Pan-Africanism is a countervailing force. It is a countervailing force against colonialism, imperialism, neocolonialism, fascism, neo-fascism, Zionism, apartheid, discrimination, marginalization, and corruption. And we gathered here, we are the countervailing force. And someone is stirring us up. Someone is stirring us up. And he is called who? Trump. He's tearing us up. He says that he's tearing down diversity, equality, and inclusion. He's tearing it down. But what he is doing, rather, is he's tearing up. He's tearing up. He's tearing up. Who is he tearing up? Harriet Tubman. He's tearing up Nzinga. He's tearing up Yasantua. He's tearing up Malcolm X. He's tearing up Martin Luther King. He's tearing up Toussaint Louverture. He's tearing up Dessalines. He's tearing up Bookman. He's tearing up Lumumba. He's tearing up Nkrumah. He's tearing up Sankara. And above all, he's tearing you up. And what he is tearing you up to do is to stand up. Stand up, stand up, stand up and resist. That is the genie in you that is rubbing that God for that genie to come up. And that is what he doesn't know. That's the essence of Pan-Africanism. Pan-Africanism is a countervailing force. And it is a countervailing force because its leaders have been dealt death blows. You can list them. Malcolm X, Cabral, Sankara, Lumumba, all of them have been dealt a death blow. Why? Because of Africa must unite. The essence of Pan-Africanism. Africa must unite. And what scares most? America and its NATO allies and apartheid Israel. They say communism, communism, communism. It scares the hell out of America. But Pan-Africanism is our force, and that scares the hell out of America too. The sheer fact that we are coming together to recover ourselves, it scares the hell out of them. Because we are Haiti. We are the Congo. What happened in Haiti? They say it should never happen again. What happened in Ghana with Nkrumah? Out of the 1945 Pan-African Congress should never happen again. But should we allow them to dictate to us? We should not allow them to do that. We are in a very serious situation in Africa. In a very serious situation. Pan-Africanism is against colonialism. Colonialism is nothing else but a serial act of dehumanization. For colonialism to succeed, it has to dehumanize every aspect of indigenous life. Your religion is bad. Your science and technology is bad. Your language is bad. Your songs and everything is bad. It has to dehumanize you. So Pan-Africanism is an act of decolonization. So we decolonize to humanize, decolonize to humanize, decolonize to humanize, decolonize to humanize. We must decolonize to humanize, decolonize to humanize. But colonization started with the doctrine of discovery. The doctrine of discovery. And the doctrine of discovery, which mandated the monarchs of Europe to go to Africa and colonize us. Then we have our own doctrine, Pan-Africanism. The doctrine, philosophy, and the ideology of decolonization and development. And we don't hardly teach it. It should be a doctrine that is taught in all schools, from the primary schools to the university levels. But this is not happening. And I'll end by saying that the tragedy is true, because in my own country, Ghana, when you mention Ghana, who comes to mind? It's Kwame Nkrumah. Kwame Nkrumah, Kwame Nkrumah. And there is no African leader or modern Western leader that wrote and published as much as Nkrumah, that I know of and that I can think of. Maybe with the exception of Lenin, that I can think of. But as I stand before you now, on this day of 9th April 2025, not a single book of Nkrumah is a required curriculum text in any of our schools in Ghana. Not a single book. Academia have self-censored themselves. Why? But Nkrumah, in 1949, made a remark that the British have banned the circulation and distribution of books by George Padmore. George Padmore. But when you are in Europe or in the UK, you go to the libraries and the bookshops, there are all the books of Marx, of Lenin, and all that. But why would they ban George Padmore's books in Ghana? And why should Nkrumah's books not be in the schools in Ghana? That is a question that I leave for you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that beautiful tribute, especially to Ambassador Eze. That was very, very important for us to, have that understanding, following on from Professor Adi's initial comments, to get that sense of how individuals, are at the heart of the progressive movement that we need to see and understand Pan-Africanism in individual as well as collective terms. Next up, Dr. Kasewa John. No, you're next.
Good afternoon. I will do my duty as the only woman on the panel. Yes. And say a few brief words about some of what I think is important when we think about Pan-Africanism. I think it was earlier evoked that, yes, by a electrifying first speaker who opened, the first Pan-African conference in 1900 was the work of the African Association, which was co-founded, I believe, by a woman from South Africa, Alice Victoria Kinloch. So when we think about Pan-Africanism and feminism, I don't think we should think that we are thinking of anything special or new. This is built into the fabric of the very first organisation that coined the term. Yet we do think of it as something new. We do think of it as something different, something not necessarily normal. And I think that's something to do with the way that we conceptualise, and I'm not the first to say this at all, but the way that we conceptualise the revolutionary or the maker of change. Right? If we don't think of women as change makers, or we don't think historically they have been, right, then it's very hard for us to imagine that to include women in anything that we do is normal or standard, right? It's something different, it's something that's going to receive pushback, it's something special. But that isn't the case at all. Lots of historians have demonstrated that actually, if you think about it, do the research, find the evidence, they're always there. We're always there, we're very present in history. So it's much more to do with, as I just said, which I don't know why I'm repeating myself now, how we conceptualise who makes history. So why? Why don't we think of women as the change makers? Why don't we think of them as the people that are making history? And there's something to do with the way that we work as historians, the way that we often privilege the written source, the way that we privilege things in archives, the way that national stories are created in looking for a great man narrative, as the previous speaker mentioned, if we're looking for Kwame Nkrumah all the time, because we want to give him his honour, we want to recognise what he's done, but what does that mean? Who do we then exclude? And sometimes it's other men who are his collaborators, and sometimes it's the people who are never on the front stage, but who are always in the background, but who are always doing lots and lots of the work. And that's often women. So I think I'm going to be very brief and say that women should always be included in both our recollections of the past, but if we can't see them, we shouldn't be sure that they're not there. Yeah. I'm not sure why you're clapping so much, but I'm glad it's resonating. Yeah, because they are actually, right? Not in the ways that you expect sometimes, not in the way that we as historians traditionally work often. But please, rest assured, they've done the work. We are always there. We were always there, and it's just a question of looking for us if you can't see us, right? The other thing I'm going to say is about language. So I was really moved at the beginning when we had, at the very opening, when we had the music. For me, the description of some of that as rhythms that I heard everywhere. This, he think the name was The King is Coming, but could be The Queen is Coming, he said. I recognized it. I heard it. I remember I danced to it. I danced to it as a ballet rhythm in Martinique. I danced Gorka to it in Guadeloupe. I was like, this is the music that has transcended in the way that he described, right? He talked about it being from Jamaica. And surely that is something about the kind of intangibles of Pan-Africanism that we have, right? That these are things that when we think of Pan-Africanism, it's not just about conferences and congresses. That is definitely a part of it. And I thank the organisers of this conference, and I thank the organisers of the first one in 1900. But there are other ways that we organise as well, and some of it is around culture, and some of it is around different types of organising, which I think is what the first speaker was alluding to. This idea that actually history making is done by the people. So the last time I was on this stage, actually, was another conference. There was a Pan-African symposium, but it was organised by students and young people who were asking questions about the Caribbean and where it fit into the story of Pan-Africanism. So as a very, very brief intro, I will say, as well as Alice Victoria Kinloch, who organised that first 1900 conference, she organised it primarily with Henry Christopher Williams, which I'm sure I'm preaching to the converted because you're here, so you know that history, but that he's from Trinidad, and yet is kind of thinking more broadly about the fate of the African continent. I think it's something we shouldn't lose, that the history of the Caribbean is bound up in this history of Pan-Africanism as well, right? When we think of the diaspora, it's not just about who's in the UK or who's in Europe or who's in the US, but it's about us globally, right? You find us everywhere. And the Caribbean is very much a part of Pan-Africanism. I think the other piece of history I'll draw your attention to is another congress, which we haven't mentioned today, which takes place in New York in 1920, which is going to have a meeting of like 20,000 people who don't unite under the term Pan-Africans, if you like, but if they're Garveyites, then we know them to be very much Pan-Africanists as we understand them, right? And they're going to produce a document, the Declaration of the Declaration of the Rights of the Negro Peoples of the World, which is an incredibly important document. It's not as old as the Mali Constitution that the ambassador mentioned, His Excellency mentioned, but it's similarly going to predate any sort of the Declaration of the United Nations by some sort of almost 30 years, right? It's a very important document, and we have so many examples in our history of coming together, collectively gathering, and creating change. Now, just because our organisations don't last for 125 years sometimes, doesn't mean they're not effective, and doesn't mean they don't move things forward one more step. And I think if I think about history and what we've learned is that we don't always see the change that we want to see in our own lifetimes, and sometimes we have to look back at our grandparents to see how far we've come. But we should not lose sight that we're still moving forward. We shouldn't get complacent about where things haven't changed because there's still more ways to go. Ultimately, I think we make progress, but it is not linear, and we have to not be disappointed when we see back steps. That's not to take away from the last speaker's very valid points about what's going on, but just to remember that, like, I'm a real believer in that Martin Luther King quote, right? That the arc of the universe is long, but it always bends towards justice. And I think I'll finish there.
Thank you very much. So that was a very important reminder for us all about the role that women play in the struggle. And I think a challenge for us was also set there. Whenever we're having conversations about Pan-Africanism, think about and ensure that we are including, the voices that are not always included in those conversations, because they're doing the work. Final speaker, Professor Gus John.
Friends, I thank my colleagues who have shared with us before. I will try not to repeat what they have said. I want to make some headline comments for us to consider during the rest of the day, and indeed in anticipation of the 9th Congress. First of all, a mini biographical note. I was born in 1945, a couple of months before the 1945 conference. I had a life experience with Britain until the age of 19 in Grenada and Trinidad, and came to this green and not so pleasant land in 1964. So what I'm going to say connects with my Africanness as a colonial subject in colonized Grenada, run by Grenadians in neo-colonialist mode on behalf of Britain, and of course my engagement with Britain and racism and European racism and capitalism and imperialism and all of that that keeps harassing us. So the 1900 Pan-African Congress, followed by the 5th Congress in Manchester 45 years later, could have laid the foundations not only for the independence from colonial rule of sovereign states as defined by the 1884-85 Berlin Conference and the horse trading that followed, but for the eventual establishment of the United States of Africa, with centers of excellence planned and developed across the continent based on particular characteristics and agreed priorities. 80, yet let alone 125 years later, we are still talking tentatively about a United States of Africa, amid growing concerns about xenophobia, a resurgence of barbarism, and genocidal internal wars. Threats to African unification and African liberation from Western capitalist expansionism, as well as the cultural appropriation and theft that we have so much evidence about, were therefore externally orchestrated while being locally executed, both on the continent and in the diaspora. The most powerful weapon in the armory of the colonizer, therefore, was the subjugated, subordinated, and subverted mind of the colonized. A key dynamic tool in that process of mental subjugation and displacement of the African self-knowledge and self-esteem was and remains racism and its framing of white supremacy. Hence, the influence eugenicists and biological racists have had throughout history and continue to have upon epistemic knowledge across the world to this day. Therefore, attempts at self-repair by African thinkers and leaders seeking to break that mold and reconnect African people with ourselves, our sovereignty, our ancestral lands, natural resources, beliefs, traditions, and systems of social organization have been systematically and murderously sabotaged by both external and internal forces. And Lome, Nkrumah, Sankara, Cabral, and many others have been mentioned so far. Hence the deep and genuine concern that is being expressed contemporaneously about the safety of Ibrahim Traore of Burkina Faso. At this historical juncture, therefore, the following questions arise. What can we learn from that legacy in order to inform and guide the building of a movement of self-repair and self-reclamation, reclamation of our land and resources towards self-reliance, and to lay the foundations for the diaspora to play the critical role of reclaiming and rebuilding our ancestral home? How do we shape and fashion our schooling and education system towards the achievement of those goals? How do we deal with the land question and ensure that land reform and food security ride in the same carriage? How do we harness the brain power, creative potential, inventions, talents, skills, and aptitudes of our people across the global African diaspora and across the motherland, so that we eliminate barriers to social and economic progress and development, especially in the wake of increasing challenges posed by climate change? How do we make our universities great again and stop undergirding the tertiary system in Europe and North America with billions of pounds and US dollars in African students' fees and accommodation costs? How can we reframe education on the continent and in the diaspora so that it performs the function of humanizing society rather than expanding elitism and widening social divisions? Africa has by far the largest youth population in the world. The African diaspora spread across the globe, especially in Europe and North America, is expanding apace. But so is the far right and cultures of anti-blackness, irrespective of the fact that British-born Africans, for example, far outnumber their immigrant grandparents and parents. What is Africa's role in ensuring that their fundamental rights, their fundamental human rights, as, for example, British Africans, especially the right to life, are not sacrificed on account of nativism and systemic racism? How can Africa work with its global diaspora to structure the modalities, not only for finally making the sixth region a reality, but for harnessing the diaspora's contribution to the development of the motherland itself? Finally, there can be no settlement with Britain and with these other European nations until Britain and Europe settles their debts to us. One major problem we still have, and it's quite incredible given our configuration in this society, is the distance and the division that there still is between Africans from the continent. My sister there, Sister Esther, can attest to the fact that we, who were both members of the African Union's Technical Committee of Experts, charged with working out the modalities for making the sixth region, the diaspora, the sixth region of Africa, have had endless problems trying to bring together continental Africans and Africans from the diaspora right here in Europe. And rather than attending to that fundamental and urgent task, you had people emerging as the Windrush Brigade, and I can't but mention them, trying to suggest that what we need to be doing is telling Massa how he loves to kiss his ass. So we come and we say, we will do your nasty work, all your filthy jobs and the overtime, nighttime work that nobody wants to do. And when we finish that, we will kiss your ass and then turn around so that you can kick our ass. That's what that narrative is about. It's about repatriating colonialism to Britain from the Caribbean. So let's not put any more glorious a gloss on it and challenge it every step of the way, because that is not getting our British-born children anywhere. It's not underlying and underscoring to Africa and indeed to Britain itself that the same laws that affect us here are the ones that affect people from the continent. We are not the only ones who suffered in the Windrush scandal, irrespective of what people might say. And so for us as Africans to be imposing and extending and perpetuating those divisions is utterly shameful. We cannot come to a settlement with Britain until Britain settles with us.
Thank you very much. Professor, just remain standing for a moment, please. As Professor John mentioned, he was born in 1945, which means a couple of weeks ago he turned 80. So can we please join together in wishing him a happy birthday? I won't ask you to sing, but can we just rise and say happy birthday, Professor John? Thank you. I shall get this on. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, I'm very, very conscious of time, and I had a whole load of questions I was going to ask for the panel, which we won't go through. But just a couple of questions for everyone to start off with. We've talked briefly about the various conferences that we have had. We have talked about the challenges that we currently have and where we need to go. What are the enduring lessons of those previous conferences that we need to ensure we are taking forward to Lome later this year, to ensure that it will actually be game-changing for us?
The enduring lesson for me is the 5th Pan-African Congress. What was it about? I am fortunate to have sat and studied at the feet of CLR James. And I asked a lot of questions. And I asked him a lot of questions about the significance of the 5th Pan-African Congress. He said, yes, There have been several congresses being held. And what was all this Congress about? It's about Africa, and which was triggered by the 1884-85 Benin Conference and the partitioning of Africa. So it's the issue of decolonization. So if you talk about decolonization, what are you talking about? It's land. So they were in the diaspora, conferences. But without land, what does it mean? So we have to have a base from where we can stretch out and liberate the rest of the continent. So they thought about it, and they decided that the peculiar nature of Sierra Leone and how it was settled may be a favorable place for them to capture that place as a base. So they were preparing Waters Johnson to go. Then a fortuitous letter came from Ghana asking for Nkrumah. And they told Nkrumah that you have to go to Ghana. Nkrumah resisted. He said that, no, I have to finish my doctorate at University of London. But they said, no, you are going. And they prepared. And the 5th Pan-African Congress, so to me, is the issue of land, and the land issue remains the same. The issue of land is land. And having a bridgehead, now as I sit in front of you, I cannot point to any liberated country on the continent. Africa has been recolonized. We don't have a base. We don't have a base. That is the reality facing us now. We don't have a base. We don't have a base. Name me one country. We don't have it. Like Ghana was. That is the essence of the 5th Pan-African Congress. We need a base. Sahel. We need a base. The Sahel. Please. Please. It is a sense of collective responsibility that secures a base. When you act in isolation, you can easily be disrupted. Grenada, what happened? It was isolated. Maurice Bishop. Look at Sankara in Burkina Faso. It was isolated. And what happened? Now Barbados are here for the Prime Minister and all that, but it looks isolated within CARICOM. But it's that sense of collective responsibility that is important, because it was that sense of collective responsibility that gathered them at Manchester. That is the most important thing. Thank you.
Changing again, and they want to make sure that their interests are advocated for, and they're very coming together to have a clear program that's shared. So I think that there's definitely that sense that these congresses take place at various important historical junctures and respond to the moment that they're living in, and they're very concerned with it, and they're very aware of it, and they're thinking collectively about how the continent can not be lost but also benefit from that moment. That's one thing. The other thing that I think happens at each of them, or that we can learn from perhaps, is that when people come together, you remember that we owe each other something, right? That we have a collective interest, that we have a shared interest, that we are not isolated and we should not act in isolation, that there is a collective that we're a part of. And whether we're from the Caribbean or Africa or born in the UK or somewhere else, As long as we understand ourselves to be descendants of Africans or Africans, then we have something in common, and we should work with that rather than worry about our differences. I think that's the second part. But also, to continue on my main theme, is that women are always there, right? In 1900, it's co-organised by a woman. In 1990's name, Hode Gibbs, she's there in France, and she's the person that organises the conference on the ground. In 1945, we know that Amy Garvey is there. She's going to be the only woman who speaks, and by that point, maybe perhaps women are a bit more isolated from organising. But we are always there, and that when we want these things to be working, we have to be inclusive. I use the example of women, but I also think we should be really careful about who we think of as should be included. It's not, if we're lesbians and we're only half included, then that's not working either, right? It has to be an inclusive vision of who we are as African people.
Two things that I think are paramount. One is that we should remember African spirituality served our peoples well over centuries. And that African spirituality and the religions that are published and practiced in Africa just now are two completely different things. African spirituality did not propagate religion or faith of one sort or another. And it's quite important that we understand that and reset and replace it. I kid you not, I am not a totalitarian, but if I had my way, all of those damn churches in Africa would have to go. They would have to go, my friends. All right? So we need to recenter that and recenter it in the lives of our people. So when I talk about education humanizing society, that is part and parcel of that whole reclamation of who we are, what we believe, how we deal with one another as a result of what we believe. And the second thing to be said, my brother talked about the land. We also need not just to reclaim and make sure that we recover our ancestral lands, but particularly what is under the earth. Because we continue going on and on about Africa is poor, while all of those extractive industries with lands commandeered and stolen by European and American and other nations, extracting wealth from under our feet, while our people remain poor and dispossessed. There's a whole heap for that 9th Congress to address itself to, and not just Trump, right? Because what we need to ask ourselves also is, how do we continue having these devastating wars and that level of barbarism within Africa itself? And what are we going to do about it?
So there are actually a number of things that are very interesting about this panel and about this gathering. And one is, what is a summing up of our experience over even the last 125 years? And one thing that emerges is there's no consensus. Because there really hasn't been any summing up of our history. And that's a very, very big problem. So if you don't really sum up the lessons of history, then you have nothing to guide you going forward. So one of the things about the 5th Pan-African Congress, which I'm going to go back to, was it was a summation of history. Those who organized the Congress summed up their own history. What were the lessons of the last 15, 20 years of our history? And then they acted upon it. They said the lessons are that it's the people who are key to everything. They are the force which is going to get rid of colonial rule. They are the force which is going to do everything. And so that was one of the key aspects of that Congress, as I said earlier. So what are the ramifications of that view? We heard later that, this is not a criticism, that Kwame Nkrumah said, seek ye first the political kingdom, and all else shall be rendered unto you. Whose political kingdom are you seeking? If you only seek the political kingdom of your enemies, you will never get anywhere. And in most African countries, Ghana included, up until the political system which has been adopted is the political system which the colonial rulers imposed on Africa. In that way, even though in ridding the continent of colonial rule in its classic form, it was the masses of the people who played the key role. When it came to what happened next, they are nowhere to be seen. So then we have the question of who are the decision makers. In every struggle that we've seen in Africa, even over the last few years, when people have needed to liberate their country from colonial rule, from neo-colonial rule, from apartheid, or whatever it is, it's the masses of the people who've been organized who played that role. As soon as we're on the verge of something new, everybody says, we're not interested in the people. Let us politicians put on a few suits and let us run things, because we know best. And so the lesson of history is forgotten. Now we're in the 21st century. It has to be, I can't go into this further because I haven't got long enough to explain things. It's the people's empowerment that is crucial in solving all these problems. It's people who must decide all these things. Not governments. Who to these governments? Let me tell you a story, just as an anecdote. Because I got invited to an AU conference many years ago. And a certain president was speaking. I won't upset anybody in my name with this president. He said, when I go and see, it was one of the Bushes who was in office. He said, when I go and see President Bush, I feel like a schoolboy going to visit my headmaster. This is a president of a country in Africa speaking at a public conference. How is it possible for the president of a country in Africa to speak in this way? If he represented the people of his country, firstly, he wouldn't speak in that way, and he wouldn't go to the president of the US as a schoolboy goes to his headmaster. But we have adopted a system in which the majority of people have no decision-making power. In the AU, the decision-making power is in the hands of a few people. It's not in the hands of the masses of the people in Africa or in the diaspora. Without solving this problem, there will be no major advances. We have to learn the lessons of history. Every struggle tells us this is what needs to be done. And we need to organize that even from today in the way that we operate. That is the thing which is going to bring successes in the future.
Thank you very much. We've really run out of time, but so we really will not have time for the question and answer session. I'm really sorry about that. Saying that, there are a few young people around the audience, and I would like to hear a young person's voice, if we can. If there's a young person, and how you define young is very, very relative. But I'll define it as being under 30 years old. So if there's a young person who would like to ask a question, please raise your hand, come forward. And yes.
Look, the professor, he said something about the people. These people, they came special. These people, they are here because they hear about the dialogue. That means that they may have a voice. And if it is too late, then you can say, okay, 5 people come in the line. And there are also people are listening now at how we are going to deal with these people at the Zoom. They also have questions. So if it is a dialogue, let me keep it as a dialogue. And I think that the moderator has to make sure that people, if they have 5 minutes, they stick to 5 minutes, because we are late, we cannot prevent the people, if it is young or elder or in the middle. I think that all people has right to ask a question. I don't think that it will be too late if we go to 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock, because that is Pan-Africanism.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, ma'am. As I respect that, but we do need to leave the venue at a certain time, and we do have another panel after this as well. So there will be opportunities, hopefully later in the day, for us to have
Wrong
those
venue.
conversations.
That's why it's part of the program. We don't own anything.
The young lady at the back, you want to see the question? Please come forward. I do accept the reprimand, though.
So firstly, I'd like to say thank you to the panel for giving us this amazing talk today, and it was a pleasure to listen in to such amazing knowledge production from such great intellectuals. So I'm from the Africa Centre, and the first question that we have today is, at the TAC, we have been pushing for and supporting African independence since 1964. How can diaspora organisations such as TAC support African states and African states realise anti-imperialist and reparations agenda, specifically in light of supporting more direct means through the African left?
Okay. So the question is about how are young people supported to develop institutions to make change? Okay. Who wants to take this? The question was about how do we support young people to challenge institutions to bring about change and genuine Pan-Africanism, as I understand it, yes?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm not sure I actually understand the question now, because what is this issue of supporting young people? Young people should get on and organise themselves. One thing that I think is important to bear in mind is that the struggle is not just in the African continent. The struggle is wherever we are. And one of the biggest problems, one of the biggest enemies of Africa is the British state, is British imperialism. So my question would be, what is it that we young people in Britain are doing to deal with this particular enemy here? How are we organising ourselves? Again, if we look back at history, we'll find that that is the orientation that people had in the past. What can we do? And the other thing is that they saw that struggle not just as something related to Africa, but something related to the way in which British imperialism, for example, acted in India, or acted wherever it was acting, in Palestine or wherever it was. And so it's important to have that understanding of that there's one humanity, and therefore there's also one struggle. And in our struggles to deal with our enemies in Africa, we also need to organise here, not just to deal with the problems in Africa, but also to deal with the problems that we face in this country. So I think there's a lot of work for not just young people, but for everybody to do, to become organised, to become involved, to look at what the problems are and how we solve them. And that's also part of this issue of we are the agents of change. It's not somebody else who's going to come and do it. We are the ones that have to do it. And so we have to find the ways, the forms, the organisations and so on. One other problem we have, and it's been addressed today, is that we have kind of Eurocentric ways of organising. So we have a few experts on the stage, and then we have everybody else who's passive, or generally passive, or they might be allowed to answer a few questions. So this is not an African-centred way of organising. But, so there are many, many problems to overcome, just in terms of how we discuss things, how we organise ourselves. We've had some of us were saying earlier, how's the liberation of Africa going to be organised if we can't organise a conference in an afternoon that starts on time, which provides refreshments to people, and this kind of thing. So there are a lot of even very basic things that we need to address and solve those problems first.
Yes, sir.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me? Is that better? Yeah. So good afternoon. Thank you so much for the talk. A question I've asked in this room for like 3 years in a row now is, and just to follow off of you, Prof, is. Oh, sorry. In your opinion, you know, with rising black maternal deaths, young people can't get a job, deportations, warmongering. In your opinions, if there's time, if not, it's fine. But what should be on the agenda for people that are racialized as black in Britain right now? In your opinion, based on what you said, does that make sense? The question makes sense. Like, what's the focus point? Where should we center around and kind of proceed to action on the basis of what you said about organizing? Thank you.
Yes, please do.
Because our elder here, who was 80 years, we should listen to what he said. I mean, yes, we have to listen to what everyone says. But the elder has said something so strikingly important about getting rid of all the churches. So that's a place we can start. You know, stop going to church on a Sunday. It's a challenge, isn't it? Stop going to church on a Sunday. Stop celebrating Christmas every December. Stop buying Christmas trees and lighting up our houses. It's not for us to be doing anymore. Isn't that a place to start, young man? Isn't that a place to start?
Can you repeat what you were saying?
Thank you very much.
Every year, don't do it. Close churches, don't go.
I shall try and be brief. Not that I want to leave the churches alone, but that's for later. What I want to say in relation to your question is this. I take part a lot in what I call intergenerational conversations, because I believe that that is important. Over the weekend, Saturday and Sunday, I was taking part with the United Friends and Families in a people's tribunal about what the state calls police killings, deaths in custody. We call them police killings or murder or manslaughter, all right? And I was telling people how at the age of 24, I was dealing with families in Leeds about bringing to justice the police officers in West Yorkshire who murdered David Olowale. I was 24 years old. Now, this year, last weekend, we were talking about the same thing, and the numbers have grown massively. All right? Now, the state as a whole and the nation doesn't consider these matters to be massive human rights violations, which indeed they are. Article 2 and Article 3 of the United Nations Convention on Human Rights. We ourselves within our communities don't have enough awareness of all of that, and so we deal with each new death in a kind of episodic way. That's one issue. The other issue is that right now, a former principal at the Institute of Education behind here, Professor Becky Francis, is doing a review of the curriculum and assessment that is in place within British schools. It's a woeful exercise. The interim report is, frankly, CRA and whatever the other letter is. So what am I saying? I am saying that although the people most affected by that government intervention are our children, most parents are totally disengaged from the fact that that is happening. In the same way that we are disengaged from the way in which these academies have been thrust upon us. And if we don't send our children to them or could demonstrate that we're educating them professionally and competently at home, we could get ourselves banged up in jail, all right? We do not have the level of organization at a granular level within our communities to address those kinds of issues, and yet they have such a major impact on our children's lives and life chances. So we need to have intergenerational conversations about that. We need people like myself and Professor Addy and those who are within these academic institutions, which remain very hostile environments, let me tell you. We need us to be engaging with the masses of people within our communities and empowering them with information, with guidance, with knowledge of how the system operates, so that they could use their own power as parents and students to bring about change.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I'm afraid we have to end this particular part of the conversation here. Apologies for the late start and the late finish. But all the lessons from this panel, indeed from the conversation, will be taken forward by the organizers and will help to shape not just the rest of today, but indeed the conference coming up in Lome. May I ask you all to please once more give your appreciation to the panel. And we will continue the conversation over the rest of the day. Kwame.
Thank you so much. Olu, and please let's give Olu some love, please. Thank you so much. Members of the panel, could you exit this way and go through there, please? Because I believe there's something for you. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take a very short 5-minute leg break, so you could just stretch. I will be calling you back at 4 minutes 30 seconds. Thank you. And could the panelists for the next panel make their way on?
Education is preparation for reparations.